Good morning. So, thank you for coming. We're in a weird COVID world, but this is really a treat for all of us. These keynote lectures really get memorialized on our website, and they're important moments for us to share important messages. And so thank you very much for coming. My name is David Andriozzi. I'm an architect and the president of the New England chapter of the ICAA, the Institute of Classical Architecture and Art. For the few of you that might be new to the ICAA, we're dedicated to the classical tradition in architecture, urbanism, and the allied arts. We do this through education, publication, and advocacy. Our institute, the mothership, is located in New York City. We have 16 chapters around the United States. Nationally, the ICAA has a broad range of educational programs, including intensives for architecture, design students, introductory programs for middle school students, lectures and walking tours, continuing education for professionals and enthusiasts, travel programs to visit classical masterpieces, publication of reprinted books, and a classical journal called the Classicist, an annual journal. This morning, we have two amazing 2021, actually 2 years, doubled up, keynote lectures. Thank you so much for joining us. Our keynote lectures have always intended to be a little bit more thought-provoking than an average lecture. We're challenging our membership to think outside the box, sort of fulfilling our role as advocacy in a thinking way. Our first speaker is Thomas Luebke. He served since 2005 as a secretary of the U.S. Commission of Fine Arts, the federal design review agency for the nation's capital. As an executive director of the agency, he produced the book in 2013, Civic Art, a Centennial History of the U.S. Commission of Fine Arts, and he initiated and guided the Monumental Core Framework Plan 2009, a major federal planning effort to extend the commemorative core of the National Mall in cooperation with the National Capital Planning Commission. Most recently, he was the editor of the Palace of State, the Eisenhower Executive Office Building, published in 2018. In addition to overseeing the Commission's review of almost 700 cases per year, he represents the Commission of Fine Arts as a member of the National Memorials Advisory Commission and the National Council of Arts and Humanities. He's an architect with experience in planning and historic preservation, both in the public and private sectors. He was Phi Beta Kappa with an honors graduate at Washington University in St. Louis, and he graduated with a master's degree from Harvard University Graduate School of Design, where he was a teaching fellow in architectural history. He was a visiting scholar at the American Academy in Rome in 2010 and 2014, recipient of the Likachev Foundation Cultural Fellowship in St. Petersburg, Russia. He served as president of the board of the Washington Architectural Foundation, a nonprofit organization of architects serving Washington, D.C. community, where he led the transformation of the institution's mission of the District Architecture Center. He was named Fellow of the American Institute of Architects in 2011, and he was honored with the Institute's Thomas Jefferson Award for Public Architecture in 2015. Please join me in welcoming our first speaker.
Well, that was probably too long of an introduction, but thank you. And it's good to be here. Only, 17 months late, but better late than never. This is a topic someone said I don't think anybody's ever addressed before this group, which is the Second Empire style in America. But this comes out of a personal history in some ways. I actually, one of my first jobs out of college was actually working on the preservation of this building in the mid-'80s. So it's kind of a long thing, and there's a kind of a long story here. But interesting story, and its relationship to classicism and official architecture in this country. I've entitled this talk today, High Style, Low Morals, the State War and Navy building in the Second Empire style. It's really just an interesting look at the different forces that brought together this kind of short-lived era in American design. There's the building if you haven't seen it. It's right next to the White House. It is, it's an enormous building, 1,000 feet long, and there's a lot of statistics there, but it was one of the largest office buildings in the world. You can see it is, people have called it a great granite pile, all sorts of other things. What it is it like all of these, of its ilk from that era, this is post-Civil War America, 1870s to 1888 was the construction. It employs a very robust vocabulary of classical elements, but it's kind of a head scratcher if you want to consider it in the, as canonically classical. There's a fairly focused but not huge sculptural program for the building. You can see it all over the place here, but and you can see the classical elements. Interiors are quite stunning, but also in that kind of mid to late Victorian way. A lot of these have just been restored, so there's some amazing spaces inside. Breathtaking public circulation and sort of conference areas. There's a kind of an interesting narrative arc here. At the time, it's a building that a lot of people have either loved or hated, but there's just been a bit of an arc here, a Cinderella story perhaps. At the time, a contemporary critic said, well, it's altogether one of the finest buildings, if not the finest building in the world, in 1892, and some 40 years later, the chairman of my commission of fine arts, Charles Moore, who was very important in implementing the monumental classical image for Washington, said, well, the State War and Navy's buildings in pseudo-classicism employed hundreds of stunted columns, a multitude of feeble pediments, projections everywhere, and a roof that a camel's humps would put to shame, all done in the name of classic art. Simplicity, proportion, dignity, and beauty, those fundamental principles of classical architecture went by the board. Now this, of course, 1930, this is the era when a whole lot of these kinds of buildings were actually being razed, or just demolished. So it was perfectly aligned with that era. 20 years later, Dwight D. Eisenhower, at that time president, said, well, put it this way, I worked 9 years in this building, and so from sentiment's sake, I would say probably I wouldn't want to see it torn down. Well, that's hardly a ringing endorsement, but at least it establishes some kind of connection. 20 years after that, in the 70s, the historian Henry Russell Hitchcock writes, it is perhaps the best extant example of America, in America, of the Second Empire. The complex massing of the mansards, especially over the center, and the dignified restraint of the detailing are unequaled. So to give us a little context on this, how did we get from A to B and now to C? Let's go way back. I'm sorry, for every lecture about anything in Washington always has to start with the L'Enfant Plan. Well, Washington has always had this opportunity, burden, responsibility, however you want to talk about it. There's sort of a rhetorical program here of literally, physically embodying the Constitution, the political enterprise of the United States, the very formation of the city, its plan, the relationship of the streets, public space, monuments is all calculated to reinforce the idea of the res publica, the public side of things. The private side is sort of subordinated into fabric. So the streets, the spaces become figural. And in those figures, sometimes you're allowed to do a temple or a big monument or something that really announces that function. The critical pieces, of course, were the Capitol. This is an early 19th century engraving of the Capitol, before its many, many alterations. Actually, it's the second dome, I believe, so it would have been from the late teens. And the White House. Now, these are both designed in the 18th century and come out of the Anglo-American tradition, neoclassicism, which really became that official style of the country in that era. Now, already, in one way, it's simple. This is part of a wider Anglo-American culture, or a British culture somewhat worldwide. This was a former colony, and it only makes sense that they were borrowing those traditions. There was, of course, as well, philosophical connection to statecraft of antiquity and political philosophy. So there was a very happy coincidence there. This is the City Hall, which still exists today, although it was modified substantially in the 30s, but this was done by the English architect George Hadfield. Hadfield, he's a practitioner in DC in the early 19th century, and it's important because he does a number of things. But I love this picture. This is a picture of the city seen from the Anacostia side, in other words, from the east-southeast side on a bluff overlooking the city, and there's not much to see. Again, this is how the L'Enfant plan really worked in a certain way. What really pops out, well, you see the Navy Yard in the foreground, and that's sort of Washington's biggest industry at that point is, surprise, surprise, it was defense. But the other things that really show up here are the Capitol and the White House. Just the two large white buildings on the hills. Now that's part of that idea of emphasizing the public function very visibly. Now I think these are exaggerated in this image, but nonetheless it sort of conveys the sense that the city was very slow to develop, so there isn't a hugely robust private development like there would have been, by contrast at this time in the 1830s. Baltimore was the second largest city in the country and a huge bustling port, and just blocks and blocks and miles of row houses, if you know that city. So back to our story about the public architecture. This is the White House, an engraving from about that time, White House, and then there are these four buildings which constitute the entirety of the executive branch. 4 departments: Treasury, State, War, and Navy. Now these two, they were designed by Hadfield. 2 of them were burned by in the War of 1812. They were rebuilt, but basically these are very simple, almost like mill buildings, right? Center-loaded corridors, bars, and then they're dressed up with pediments. That was pretty much the way you did things in that area. So by the 1830s, there's a kind of a leap forward. The Treasury has a special role here because of money. They are collecting tariffs, they are managing ports, they are doing all this stuff, and they Robert Mills, whom I'm sure you all know, ends up in Washington because of the Washington Monument design. He designs this massive new building for the Treasury Department. So what they're doing, those 4 buildings that were around the White House, maybe we should, just one. Around the White House, they decided they're going to put the Treasury on one side, and so you can see they've already erected. This is a photograph from the 1840s. They're sort of finishing the main part by Mills. That's the old State Department there in the corner that it's about to engulf. It doesn't actually get finished until after the Civil War, but there is the Treasury Department completed in about 1869. It's significant because, of course, it extends that tradition of the sort of Georgian or Adams-style kind of classicism of the late 18th and early 19th century, but this is actually in a much more monumental way. Now, by this time, we're getting into this mid-century Victorian era, and things are starting to go away from that canon. For example, in Washington, there's the Gothic Revival, which has a certain appeal, and is particularly gets applied to institutions and other uses where there's a kind of it seems like there's maybe a moral argument involved. So we have the Smithsonian Castle by James Renwick. We have the other, on the upper right there, we have the DC Jail, which is actually by Robert Mills. Again, there was a kind of a moral idea about what you're supposed to do, take penance in your incarceration. And then below that, the Thomas Ustick Walter, this very long building up on the bluff. That's the St. Elizabeth's Federal Hospital for the Insane. So that was a hospital that this building actually still exists, and it's just been renovated as somewhat, maybe ironically, as the headquarters of the Department of Homeland Security. The other thread that we get into in the mid-century in these monumental buildings is a topic that doesn't get a lot of play, but it's actually sort of interesting. The more I looked at it, I was like, wow, this is really a thing. I would call it the Baroque Revival or Neo-Baroque design. It really informs so much of what we see in that mid-19th century, 1850s to 70s. It's taking, obviously, just like the Baroque did, it takes the classical elements, but kind of rejiggers them, recomposes them, changes their scale. It's much more plastic, much more adaptive, and kind of expands on what you would find in a vocabulary of forms coming out of antiquity. So, for example, the Capitol Dome, this is designed in the late 1850s by Walter, and it, you know, as everybody knows, it's a copy, or it's derived from European precedents, particularly St. Paul's in London, which is in turn derived from St. Peter's in Rome, but it's essentially a big symbol of authority. But the real issue is that it comes out of that. It's not a Renaissance style. It's not canonically antique. It's actually a kind of a reinterpretation on this it ends up being very florid, right? If you look at the detailing on the dome, et cetera, it's quite stunning. So here we are. This is a Currier and Ives engraving. It's actually from about 1880, showing this city. Now remember that view from the Anacostia side. This is now a kind of an imaginary aerial. You have the Capitol with the dome completed. The White House complex is over on the left in its little garden. The Treasury is on the Capitol side, and this new building that they're trying to build for State, War, and Navy departments is on the left. This is in this new style. You can see the Washington Monument. You can date this image because the Washington Monument remains a stump. Construction begins in the 1840s, and it gets interrupted by a lot of things, but it doesn't resume until 1881, completed in 1885. So that's a kind of a thing. But from the point of view of the city, you can still see how low and undeveloped it is. It's much more than it was in that earlier picture or generation earlier. Pennsylvania Avenue is that sort of robust spine that connects the two. So as early as the 1840s, I think this is about 1850, they decided that they wanted to consolidate those dumpy little buildings from what we call the Hadfield buildings into a new federal office building for the rest of the government, which was the Departments of State, War, and Navy, although by this time, about this time, they were about to establish Departments of Interior and Agriculture. Those come in the 1850s. But essentially, remember, this is still a very young country with not that, it's just not that much, not that many people, et cetera. But this leads us directly now into this later 19th century story. In terms of architectural style, we have two threads. One is stylistic, and the other is a little bit more about the way things work, power and its assertion. So the French side is that French soft power was huge in the 19th century. Music, art, dance, you name it. French style was really preponderant, and that's where our story starts. It gets taken up and disseminated by the British, who are actually running the world at this point. They have this worldwide empire, and they have administrative apparatus and bureaucracy. The sun never sets on the British Empire by this time. So it's sort of a fusion of two different threads. There's a little bit of a typological manifestation here too, where the French style tends to go towards things of culture, art, leisure. The British side of things tends to go towards the more official, et cetera. So that takes our story all the way back to the 17th century with the expansion of the Louvre. This is the center pavilion as it looked in about 1650. That's what became the Pavilion de l'Horloge, but it doesn't have l'horloge meaning a clock. It doesn't have it at that point. It gets massively redone and reworked in the mid-19th century with this all expansion that everybody's familiar with, but you can see that's the Pavilion de l'Horloge in the background, and then all this new stuff that gets put on. This is actually now this incredible assertion of this French state. In the Bourbon Restoration is where it begins, and then it's sort of more so under Napoleon III. There's Napoleon III and Empress Eugénie at the Tuileries Palace. There's a certain kind of international glamour that is being put put forward here. The architecture is sumptuous. It's overwrought. It's also concomitant with what is really, in Western Europe and beginning in the United States, we'll get to that in a sec, a burgeoning new class of middle class and mercantile society, and there's all sorts of stuff that's being generated. It's much more consumption oriented. The idea of urban life, it really gets celebrated through you see this with the Impressionists later on in the century, but there's all sorts of things that are starting to be developed. Opera houses, department stores, just urban life in a way that didn't exist. You have gas, street lighting, all sorts of things that are changing, and money. There's so much more money and stuff to buy. So it's a kind of a new change, and this, of course, is concomitant with the Industrial Revolution, which generates all the wealth behind it. Back to our Pavillon de l'Horloge. This is this kind of, they take that original 17th century thing, and it just kind of reworked, kind of encrusted with sculpture. You can see how it's almost like something Rococo from Dresden in the 18th century. But you can see how rich it is. But the basic idea, it's typical of this French treatment, is that the orders are stacked. You do not get super orders for the whole building. Very horizontal disposition, and then marked centers and corners with pavilions, often pedimented and with some kind of a bulbous or slanted roof called mansard from Francois Mansart, an earlier architect. So those are sort of the elements of this style. So here we are back in Boston. This is the new City Hall, which is built in 1855. It's kind of interesting to look how similar that derivation is. Now this one's interesting because it actually has a little bit more sophisticated composition of base, a kind of a piano nobile, a second story which is a little bit aggrandized in the center, and then you get into these sort of attic treatments. But it's a very similar pavilionized approach, and I think quite well composed. This is one of the earlier treatments in America, but it's followed elsewhere. Like, for example, just in Washington, D.C., across the street from the State War and Navy Building is the Corcoran Gallery by James Renwick. James Renwick, he did the Trinity in Church in New York, and he did the Smithsonian Castle. He's obviously very capable. This is the Corcoran Gallery in this new French style. It's really derived from the French urban palaces, the Hôtel Particulier that you see, designed in the 1850s. It doesn't actually get completed until a bit later, but you can see it. And again, this is the sort of the French thread of things. It's a little bit more compact. It's a little bit more, you can sort of understand it's a cultural institution. You can sort of imagine that there's a hierarchy of space inside. You can sort of see how it breaks down if you look at it. Now, to the British side. This is based on this sort of new style which was emerging in Paris, and everybody thought the Louvre was amazing. There's a huge competition in 1857 by the War Office in Britain for a new headquarters in Whitehall, and out of the, I think, 7 finalists, 2 of them are in this French style, and this is the winning style by architects Garland, I believe, I can't quite read it without my glasses. Thank you. Garling it is, and they don't end up doing much. It doesn't get built. You've never heard of them, But what's interesting about it is, look at the scale. It's just massive, and it's a little bit less florid than the Louvre, but you can sort of see this marriage of massiveness, and you can imagine this bureaucratic edifice in the abstract becoming a bureaucratic edifice in reality. This is not just an American, its derivation doesn't just go to America, it goes all over the place. You get this mansarded, official style in Canada, Australia, Calcutta. You've got Vienna, everybody's copying it in some ways. In some of the other parts of the world, like South America, this style actually lives on in a certain way, in a kind of a Belle Epoque style that you see like in places like Buenos Aires, et cetera, in Mexico City. Well, this takes us to our American side of the story. The architect in question, Alfred B Mullet, who was the architect, and inseparable from this is the story of President President U.S. Grant. Starting with Mullet. Mullet was born in England, raised in Ohio, ended up apprenticing as an architect and worked for Isaiah Rogers, who was a Boston architect who did a lot of work in the Northeast. Really developed, this 19th century story, developed the idea of the luxury urban hotel. Tremont House is one of his first big ones. He did Astor House in New York. He did Maxwell House in Nashville, which is, I have a picture of it. And so the reason why I bring this up about the hotels is the hotel is another one of these emergent typologies of the mid-19th century. Think it's room after room after room. So you have this kind of repetitive thing. It's sort of associated to utilitarian architecture of a mill building, right? Extruded, double-loaded, simple construction, except that it's got this sort of lifted purpose now. It's luxury. They've got actually flushing water, I believe, is it Tremont or Astor? Anyway, they start to really bring in these sort of luxuries that were unheard of. And then you're trying to work in the special spaces inside. So Rogers ends up, through his friendship with Salmon Chase, who becomes the Secretary of the Treasury, he ends up coming to Washington to become what is called the supervising architect of the Treasury in the 1850s. Now that job is big because the U.S. is embarking on this huge program of building custom houses, Treasury buildings, post offices all over the country, and it's all being managed through the Treasury Department. Rogers is the guy. He doesn't last that long, and Mullet comes in, works in his office for a few years, and then succeeds him as the supervising architect. Now, this is coincident with, in 1869, this is the election, and U.S. Grant becomes president. The title of this is High Style, which I think we've covered a little bit. The low morals, of course, is this association with late 19th, this sort of post-Civil War era, which is remarkable, at least in that administration, for a kind of a lower level of moral standard, which was, sort of rampant. There's a lot of arguments about how this came about. Was it the fallout from the Civil War? There was certainly an idea of let's leave that all behind. There's a tremendous amount of wealth being generated and a whole new style of life, urban life. A lot of American cities were pretty gritty and awful in the mid-19th century, and by the end of the century, a lot of them have become fairly lovely with big parks, paved streets, sewer systems, et cetera. So there's a kind of a transformation going on. So this is all starting to happen. Just for context, the United States at the end of the Civil War, it's still a kind of a provincial place in the world. And by the end of the century, 35 years later, it is unquestionably at the top, handful of countries in the world. Steel production increases in that period by 50 times. It surpasses England in the 1850s. Rail, in the first decade following the Civil War, the railroads quadruple in this country. I just have to put a little picture here that there's just this tremendous explosion of economic growth and all the wealth and all this stuff that comes with it, leading us right into what we now call the Gilded Age, and this is the beginning of it. Back to our story about the supervising architect of the Treasury. They undertake, Mullet then, in this period, undertakes the designs of a whole lot of public buildings in every major American city. Big, huge courthouse, post office, custom house complexes, probably the most sumptuous of which was in New York. This is the sort of the frontispiece of the building. It doesn't quite look like this, but this was built and then eventually torn down. But there's another one in St. Louis. Boston was raised I think in the 30s. Philadelphia, that's the New York one as built. Chicago gets one that's sort of changed. This is the same time they do the Grand Mint in San Francisco, and there's a beautiful kind of syncretic kind of in New Orleans, the other really big American city at the time, which you may know. The other side of this, the corruption, there's all sorts of issues with the grant administration. The whiskey ring, the granite ring. There's bid rigging. There's graft. There's people paying for off. It's a kind of a mess. Orville Babcock, I'm just mentioning him in passing just because of this kind of the moral looseness of the era. Babcock was an aide to Grant during the war, ends up being his assistant in the White House, and runs the Office of Public Buildings and Grounds, and then he sort of takes, when they sort of push Mullet out of the way after he finishes the State Department side of this building, and Babcock, who is not an engineer, well, I think he's an engineer, but he's not an architect, he comes in and he sort of, they manage to build it, but they take the longest of any time, and the floors don't quite align. It's a little bit of a mess. And meanwhile, he gets indicted for involvement in the whiskey ring, and then there's a famous trial in St. Louis, and Grant actually goes and testifies in favor, in his defense. He's acquitted. But there's this funny political cartoon from 1876 where Grant is considering a third term, and you can see, I don't know if you can see this, he's hanging on the whiskey ring and the granite ring. He's holding up all these guys, who are somehow tainted by scandal, and of those 6 guys he's holding, 4 of them are very directly involved in the construction or management of the old Executive Office Building. You've got the Secretary of War, who you've got Secretary of Navy. You've got Babcock himself is in the lower right, and up in the upper left is actually a guy named Alexander Shepard, who was originally the plumbing contractor for this building, ended up being the governor of the District of Columbia. So anyway, that's just sort of the moral background of the story. But let's go back to the design itself. Here it is. This is sort of the approved design. You can see, compared to some of these other, the French examples I was talking, there's a certain austerity here. If you take away the hats, the crazy stuff at the corners in the middle, it's actually an incredibly, almost relentless composition. First of all, it's huge. It's got all these endless corridors inside, et cetera. But it's sort of masterfully done, where he takes these architectural pieces and dresses it up so that it actually builds up to this kind of intensity at the middle. There it is. The plasticity of the Second Empire was such that you could do things that you could never get a temple form to do. So I think that was the appeal. In reality, the plan, look at that, it's just incredibly basic. It is a double-loaded corridor scheme, and all you get are these sort of special things at the middle. You get stairways in the inner corners. They sort of squeeze the major rooms, the libraries and reception rooms, into these pavilions, but it's not necessarily, you can't really understand it on the outside, and they often, they're almost seem like an afterthought on the inside. Look at that section. It almost looks like a prison yard. It's so, there's this sort of incrustation on the outside that belies a very, very utilitarian core. But there's gorgeous detailing. These are granite stairs, which are completely cantilevered into the walls and self-supporting. They're just absolutely elegant. There you go. For those, I included some of these pictures because people don't usually get inside. It's an amazing building. Again, there was quite a bit of, there's a iconographic program, which is kind of limited. It's nothing like the Louvre, where it's just everywhere. This is just certain points that, every pediment reflects the department that was going to occupy that part of the building. Taking us back to the utilitarian DNA of the building, we've got this story about cast iron construction and modularity, which we're seeing here in the Soho and the Howitt Building, 1857. And there's our Maxwell House Hotel in Nashville from the late 1850s. Now, this is when Mullet would have been working on, he probably worked on this project, and you can see the kind of the simplicity. This building goes from its sort of very formal portico, and as it kind of wraps the corner, all that stuff starts to drop off, and you end up with this kind of boom, 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 boom. It's just, it could be a warehouse in the back. So that's sort of this interesting question is, is an office building just, a government office, is it just the progeny of, a warehouse plus palace equals office building. Now, it's kind of interesting, you know, so you look at this and you can sort of, it's composed very much in these layers, but underneath it all, it's very simple. Oops. The next phase, though, this building gets completed, and of course, it's actually out of date well before it's finished. It takes 18 and a half years to build, starting in 1871 when the Second Empire is at its height, and by the 1880s, it's, you know, everybody's kind of moved on. Then this is really the other part of this story, is why and what happened to that style. And I think the quickest way to talk about it is that it was really a style. It was fashion. It was a little bit shallow in terms of its appeal. While it was very popular for a while, it was quickly replaced. And it is the Second Empire is this sort of Baroque, what I've sort of called this Baroque, a variant of a Baroque Revival. It doesn't actually have a moral argument that people make for it. It doesn't have a Pugin for, you know, somebody who's arguing for the moral correctness of the Gothic, or, you know, the arts and crafts movement, or even modernism. There's not like this sort of, it doesn't sort of get deep into where people really say this is obviously the way to go. And certainly classicism has had its proponents that way in a moral argument. So it's very popular. This is Market Square in Washington, D.C. This is now where the archives is, but you can look at this very florid kind of architecture in every direction. This is Pennsylvania Avenue from a little bit further up towards the White House, the Capitol in the background. Hotels, you know, these are hotels that might have been in a little bit more of a federal or Italianate style that get redone with these crazy roofs. These are institutional buildings in Washington. One is on the left is a impoverished genteel ladies' home called the Louise Home, and the other is a convent school. There are urban blocks which go on and on. All these, by the way, all these have been demolished. Sorry, these have all been demolished because they're now downtown, basically downtown DC. On the left here is the British legation. That was the British embassy until the Lutyens project in the 30s. On the right is one of those fabulous, you know, silver mining fortune senators from Nevada's house. I think it was Stewart's Castle in DuPont Circle. And then elsewhere, you know, this is that, you know, following the Empire style to its end, you know, you get these sort of theater and hotel complexes. It sort of veers into, you know, easy pleasures, right? It's the Baldwin Hotel and Theater in Sodom on the Bay, San Francisco, or the Gilded House in New York. It's very florid, and you can see how it sort of runs out of steam. And while it has this big appeal briefly, it trickles down into commercial architecture all across, you know, especially in the Midwest. You know, a lot of these older cities that were developed in that era, in the late 19th century, retained that kind of commercial character. But it's the same stylistic feeling of P.T. Barnum circuses. You know, it's got this kind of very loud, you want it demands attention. So what's interesting about it is it's this association with power, consumption, wealth, luxury, status. It's so overt, it sort of, I think it gets eclipsed in the end. It doesn't have a deep resonance with maybe an underlying cultural sensibility in the United States. So by the 20s, it's really fallen out of favor. First of all, you've seen the neoclassical revival. This is actually that New York Post Office and Custom House being torn down. The statue in the foreground, which is no longer there, is called, I think it's called Virtue Defeating Vice, or Triumphant Over Vice, which I find ironic. But this sort of lives on in the popular imagination. The Second Empire, it sort of has this feeling of sort of a faded idea of sort of superseded antique wealth. It's kind of dreamy. It's a little bit strange. This is the Magnificent Ambersons in 1942. You know, where the idea is this grand family and big fortune in Indiana, and then they sort of fall into their fortune falls away, etc. It's a sort of a recurring thing. Giant, 1956. There it is. It's always that kind of Second Empire building, being the background of the story, like that is sort of like this incredible aspirational moment, which is kind of a dream, or sometimes it's a nightmare. That, but it's weird. It's always, and then eventually, it goes from nightmare into caricature. So you have the Addams Family, and there it is again. It's the Second Empire style. So, it's kind of run this course. But as I mentioned, across the Midwest and other parts of the country, it actually was, in a way, the fabric of daily life in the little commercial towns. This is actually Disneyland. And, Walt Disney grew up in rural Missouri in a town that probably looked not quite so Disney-ish as this, but it's the same idea, that there's all these little commercial establishments that were put up. So what happened, I alluded to maybe this lack of cultural resonance in America for that kind of, it's vaguely foreign, sort of florid and maybe overwrought. A couple of things. There was, of course, the massive appeal and enduring, decades, even to this day, the Colonial Revival mode. This is just a kind of a generic house. I think it might be in Greensboro or something. But also in the official architecture, there's the Chicago Fair, designed by Daniel Barnum, or planned by Barnum and designed in part, of the 1892-3. This really asserted so strongly this idea of Roman classicism and a kind of an imperial scale, white, grand. Again, now we're back to the super order. This very, very large scale compositional, and it's very powerful, and that becomes the mode for 40 years or more for American architecture. Burnham himself then takes on what's called the Macmillan Plan, the Senate Park Commission Plan of 1901-1902, to try to impose some kind of an appropriate image on the city of Washington. And this is, of course, the very famous view of it. And the amazing thing, I always look at this and I'm like, it's amazing how it kind of looks like that. They really did it. It's kind of incredible because it didn't look like that before. D.C. was a very bricky city. There was lots of, there wasn't so much order to the plan. So, oops. Is that me out of time? Must be close. But I'm almost done. Yeah, it's tolling for me. Yeah. So as early as this is a sketch by John Russell Pope from about 1917. This was an idea to take the State War and Navy building and turn it into what it should have been in the first place, a Treasury Twin. So you can see that you might look at this and go, well, it's the Treasury, but you can see the outline. There's red lead pencil in the background that you can see all the mansards and chimneys, et cetera, behind it. By the way, the Navy Department moves out about this time. War Department by the 30s. This was the State Department since 1874, right? They finally move out in the late 40s. So it was the State Department of the United States for a long time. This is an idea that does not go away. This is 1931 by Waddy Wood, a DC architect. You can see on the right is the existing elevation of the building, and then they're going to just completely rework it in a monumental style. Meanwhile, the building is crammed. This is now getting into the 20th century. This is probably the late 20s. We've got people just nook and cranny. We've got files in the rotundas, and I mean, it's just nuts. What happens is the office of the president starts to grow. Roosevelt administration, it starts moving in the 1930s, and then they take over the whole building by 49. So it's absolutely the office building of the executive office of the president. During the war, all sorts of stuff happened. They painted out all those amazing skylights. They took away, they took the decorative cannon from the Spanish War, et cetera, and melted it down. Moving forward, this is actually the early 80s. You can see the cabling that had been just installed, shall we say. On the lower left is a conference room that underneath all those gold draperies was the space on the right. Sort of that they had dropped in a ceiling with fluorescent lights, but underneath it all was this actually amazing 1880s interior. This was the War Department library. So the end of the story is that finally, in the early 2000s, about 2008 to 16, they finally, for the first time, undertook a comprehensive renovation of the building. Systems. When I worked there in 1984, every single window had a window air conditioner unit in it. It was, and that was, that went on and on and on. The systems were terrible, the cabling, so everything was redone. The building was hardened on the exterior for blast. So this is a huge undertaking, and it has yielded some amazing results. Just very, very quickly, you can just sort of see how beautiful it is. This was the Secretary of Navy's office. Now it's the Vice President's ceremonial office on the east side overlooking the White House. This is what's called the Indian Treaty Room, but it's the library for the Navy that was a couple floors above, it shows some of the decorative elements, but then also in the lower right, the restoration work of detail. Same thing in one of the stair hall domes. And one of these was one that was painted out, you saw earlier. This is the Secretary of War's suite, which you can see in the upper left was, sort of a wild Victorian interior. Then it was stripped down to, just bare beige and white by the late 20th century, and then has been restored on the left. So we're left now with an amazing survivor of the Gilded Age in this building. It's been so much reconstructed, but we're glad to have it as a cultural resource. It is not, as I said, the French Empire style ended up being something that didn't go, it sort of ran its course and then went away. And I think there's probably a longer, stronger tradition that it lives on in classical design, although this is obviously derived from it. So anyway, it's an interesting piece for you to think about. I encourage you, I have a copy of this book that we did a couple of years ago. It's available for purchase online. It's starting to go out of print, but it's beautiful because it shows the whole story. So with that, I'm thrilled to have a chance to share with you that story. And great. And
do we have any questions? Raise your hand. We don't have a microphone, so we'll repeat them up here. Raise your hand and you can talk.
Yeah.
Seems that in the United States there's always been a battle over what's supposed to be the American style, notwithstanding that America is a nation of immigrants. So it stands to reason that styles are multifarious. And I was wondering, I think of classical as Greek and Roman, but then other styles that you mentioned succeed. They come to America from Europe. They battle with each other, and then modernism comes. But my question is, what really is classicism? Because classicism seems to be both the foundation of traditional architecture and a portion of what traditional architecture is now.
It's a great question, and boy, it's kind of a big question for I guess obviously I think I'd be preaching to a group that may know more about it than I if I tried to answer that question completely. Clearly, it operates at several levels. Obviously, it's a architectural expression which at a certain time in antiquity under certain, the sort of the Greek and Roman, it was the only, architectural expression in that milieu. It gets revived, obviously, in the Renaissance and then carried forward in the West as a kind of I think it's sort of like the most continuous part of architectural expression beginning from the Renaissance forward. At least it gets really taken up in the 18th century in England, or in Britain, and by virtue of Britain's global heritage and power, it gets disseminated widely across the world. So, I think it's hard to separate the antique from the European heritage of the early modern and the last few centuries, versus then we have our own, as I've just described, sort of two major phases of classical expression here in this country. The first, from the first part of the 19th century, and then beginning in the 1890s through the 30s, two major periods. In terms of official, you also have to consider it in terms of, I guess, increasingly the classical mode, while I sort of feel like it is the base note against which a lot gets measured, there's a lot more options that emerge over time because of technology, taste, et cetera. As I said, typological innovation. It's easier to do an opera house by Charles Garnier in a kind of, that's sort of got a kind of a Baroque revival vibe, because you can sort of, it's so much more compositionally fluid than if you look to antiquity for just the formal expression. So I'm not sure where the question leads in terms of where we are. Are you asking about where we are today, or?
I think just basically, today classicists, people in this room, battle over whether it's a style or a mode.
Yeah. I think it's both, though. I think that, one of the interesting things about classicism as let's leave the style part aside, because the style actually has an enduring appeal for whatever reason. The question is, what's the difference between a style versus a mode or a philosophy? As a style, I think there's an enduring appeal, at least in this country. We see it all the time. All of you, many of you are practitioners here who work in that, and there's always interest in it. It seems like it's never really stopped. The other part of it is the mode of it, which is a kind of a sense of, I think that to me it's always a question of hierarchy, and being able to show hierarchy of form, and then expressing that through the detail that creates a unity. Now that can go down from the building. Let's go from the middle level of the building. That sense of hierarchy of conception can go down to the level of detail, but it actually can go out into the sense of the urban scale as well. So that, to some extent, that's one of the reasons why I think working in Washington is so interesting, because it's one of the few places where that sense of order is actually still inherent in that play. So I hope that answers your question a little bit, but it's an interesting one for practice. Yes.
So the architects of that era, and I think you touched on it, were dealing with the change in scale of the Industrial Revolution, in terms of buildings were so much bigger at that point than they were prior to that. So the question about the Second Empire is, beyond the fashion and the style of it, how much of the popularity of design had to do with the form making of a style or a building type where the big part of it was the mansard roof? Because the mansard roof sort of seemed to do two things. It allowed a small building to lower its heat height by 2 or 3 or even 4 stories, where the architect would tuck the top floors into that part of the roof. And the mansard roof is also really appealing from a form-making size perspective, in that the slope of the roof was so shallow that it didn't really, make it difficult to get something in the roof. The diagrams that slope of the roof also has a kind of residential component.
Yeah.
And then the second part of the question is with the revival of traditional styles today, the style that's the most taboo and the most even unaccepted by this group, and you know, any Shell or Mansard group from modern architecture
No.
would like, you know, freak out. Like, why is that not coming back when our buildings are even bigger than the buildings?
Sure. It's a double question. I'm told I need to repeat this. The question is, the Second Empire style allowed maybe to build buildings that were in this 19th century period, Industrial Revolution period, bigger than they had been, and that you could actually get another floor in or more into these mansards. How much of that was actually practical in terms of being able to accommodate more, and it certainly added more visual interest. And then in the current times, if it allows you to make a bigger building, why is it, to some extent, I think, you didn't use the word anathema, but let's just say it's considered to be the last kind of style that anybody would ever, you'd want to see, like in a, you know, whatever, I can't remember how you put it, but a modernist, but actually most classicists would probably balk at the idea of ever working in this mode. I think it comes back down to the idea of fashion. It's really about cultural forms that get carried forward, and do they resonate or not? And the French style of it came out of the Renaissance with these steep roofs, and it was practical. You have a classical forms with lower roofs, flat roofs, which come out of a Mediterranean culture. Don't, you know, the steep roofs do well in places where it snows a lot, right? It works better. And then it just sort of gets incorporated as a kind of a part of the building style. As to making a building bigger, or look smaller, I'm not sure which it is. I actually think that it makes if you look at this, it actually makes the building look bigger rather than smaller, because you could go up higher with these big pointy things. It's much more sculptural, as opposed to the classical one, which actually subordinates that attic story as a kind of a very minor kind of line set behind a balustrade. You don't really see it. The Treasury Department has a 5th floor, but you don't really notice that it's there. Whereas this thing, you know, this thing's got a full floor at the level of those dormers, and then even more so above that. So I think it was really about style and expressing a kind of a temporary, evanescent ethos of luxury and consumption, and that we're all part of this very cosmopolitan new scene that is all about, you know, opera and, you know, department stores, all this new stuff that was being engendered by the Second Industrial Revolution. In the current day, you know, it's interesting you mentioned the modernism and how it goes today. You know, I think it's too florid for contemporary tastes, just generally. It just doesn't resonate. There was a period, if you go back to the late 60s and early 70s, in modernism, people did experiment a little bit with mansards. You occasionally find, even in suburban stuff, I remember suburban houses that, well, and of course there's the classic strip mall, you know, is it a McDonald's? You know, there was a kind of I can't remember, one of them I always had, Pizza Hut. No, it's not. Is it Burger King? Anyway, it was a kind of it's a way, it's also, you know, the mansards, you know, with that you sort of get to hide all the mechanical equipment on top, you know, so there's a kind of a practical quality. But for some reason, I just think it conveys a kind of I think maybe it is that there's a kind of a funny pretentiousness to it that people just don't really want to be part of. There's a kind of idea like, we're so fancy. That's what it was in 1865 or 70. It was like, oh, let's be fancy, ba-ba. And I think that, you know, now that it's just considered maybe a little bit too much over the top. I don't know if anybody else has a thought about it, but there was this, yeah.
Can you make the exact same analogy to the modern Bulfinch buildings that are going up, that they're completely over the top, and and perhaps ahead of us would be the rejection of that
Well,
to this democracy and classicism?
I don't know. I think it's too early to tell. I mean, but certainly what you can say is that everything goes in and out of style, and there's always that 35, 40-year, gosh, I can't believe they were doing that then. So, I mean, stick around. That, like, is it the courthouse or the San Francisco project? You know, that's, what is that now, 20 years old? We'll see. There was, oh, you want to follow up on that? Just, I'm sorry, I'll get.
I want to follow up with this. I think that, you know, there's a geopolitical aspect to it, and the lack of that moral or philosophical underpinning
Yeah.
to the Second Empire style. But the reign of Napoleon certainly was relatively short, and he fell with in ignominious way to the Prussians. And also there was the French excursion into Mexico in the 80s after. So was there some kind of cultural rejection of French principles because of the decline of Napoleon III?
The question is whether the geopolitical impact or association with the French Empire with the reign of Napoleon is somehow affected its reputation worldwide. And my sense is not so much that these things are looser than that. Remember, it started before him. It started under the Bourbon Restoration, and all that work of the Louvre was actually started in the 1830s, which was way before him. And then it continues in some way, you know, the very image of Belle Epoque architecture. It's not so much man-started, but take away the peaky roofs and you're sort of there. And you think about all of the countries, a lot of them in Latin America and Eastern Europe. There's like a lot of places where this kind of very ornate reinterpretation of classicism with a tremendous decorative program carries way forward. And I think it has to do with the persistence of the soft power divorced from the actual hard realities of the Franco-Prussian War or whatever it was that brought it up or down. I think that there's a cultural resonance. Because of this Baroque, remember the Baroque, this is Neo-Baroque, or the Baroque Revival, and that comes out of Baroque, which comes out of the reassertion, it's Italian in origin, and comes out of the reassertion of the Catholic Church into all of its, you know, areas where it holds sway, and it becomes a kind of a cultural norm in a way that I think classicism or its more strict derivatives becomes a cultural norm in the more Anglo-British sphere of things. So I think that it's almost like there's a little bit of a you know, the British style tends to go towards the more austere, and the other countries often go into something that's a little bit more florid. And I think it actually comes back down to maybe, you know, really deep cultural resonances, like coming from the Reformation. Right, in the Counter-Reformation. Now I'm going to get back to this guy. Yeah.
Could you say a little more about the Romantic? And you went from Mills and that classicism to the Princeton Empire. You mentioned briefly the Gothic and the emergence of the Gothic with Gilmore. I'm curious because Gothic actually had more underpinning.
Yeah, for sure.
But it was very short-lived. And in the case of the mall, and I'm curious about the mall because I don't know a lot about history, but I at one point saw a design for the mall that was done by Downey.
That's right.
And that when I first saw the drawing, I thought it was like Central Park.
Right.
It was much earlier than Central Park. I'm curious how or why the Romantic spirit, either in landscape design, which does emerge in New York during the period of the Princeton Empire, maybe slightly later, why we don't see more of that in DC, either in architecture or landscape?
I think that's it's an interesting question. DC is always a little bit late to the game because it's not an industrial city and it doesn't have a big kind of indigenous wealth producing class. It's always people coming in with money or power from somewhere else. So it doesn't. So there's a problem of resources and there's a problem of advocacy. So it's slow. At the same time, all these big redevelopments in the major cities, and I'm not an expert on this by any means, but let's just say most of it happens after the Civil War anyway. You know, Boston, Philadelphia, like all the big Olmsted projects that you know. The Capitol complex you know, is Olmsted in DC is right after 1868. DC starts to think about this, and the mall idea is right. That's from Downing, and that's, I think, 1850-ish, 51. Yeah, it's one of those. So what they lacked, they did implement it in part, but what they didn't do is implement it in a comprehensive way. The thing about this, the Macmillan Plan, is that it said not only are we going to redo the mall, we're going to redo the whole city, and they developed this entire huge layered plan that not only does it remake impose this whole new order on the monumental core of the city, but it sets up Rock Creek Park along those, well, Rock Creek Park's already been established for 10 years, but it sort of works into that system, and then it establishes this circle of they were Civil War forts that try to get linked through parklands, the riverfronts. It's a comprehensive approach. It's 1901, you know, most of the cities were already doing this in the 1870s or 80s, you know, so it's that story. There are, there are little, there are rural cemetery examples in DC. There are different things, but it does miss that bigger impetus of the mid-century. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I was just going to make a comment on more from the point of view of preservation than design. Going back to an experience in the late 1970s, there's a quite notable French Second Empire house designed by Henry Austin in New Haven, the Navy mansion. That Yale had come to own, and there was a developer, and Vincent Scully led a campaign to save it. And he said that you can't just tear things down when the style changes and you don't have any particular respect for a particular style. And his conclusion was, save it all, which maybe isn't really going to happen, but he did succeed in saving that, so the house is still there. And I was interested to see in your presentation that Henry Russell Hitchcock in the 1970s was advocating for the preservation of the State War Navy building. And he, of course, was a great champion of modernism, but he was an astute enough critic that he could see the value in that building because it was a very good example of what it was. So he was judging the building on the basis of quality, not style. He wasn't dismissing it because it was in a particular style. And I think that is a great lesson to learn, that style isn't a reason to dismiss something, but that there are ways of discerning quality.
Yeah, and the comment being that I don't know, again, I'm repeating this for the recording, that Henry Russell Hitchcock, the modernist historian, advocated for the protection of the old executive office or the State War and Navy building because he saw it as a particularly high quality example of its style, and that in the end the issue wasn't so much about the style, but that I think it's really as its persistence as an exemplar as a cultural artifact. And I would agree with that. One of the things that makes it special, in addition to I don't know, you'd have to judge for yourselves. Is it the best of the lot? I don't know. I think the one in New York. Let's see. I want to go back to that picture of. Sorry. I want to go back to that picture of, there it was, of these buildings in New York. They're all of a cloth, right? They're all the same kind of thing. The New York one may be the best. Some of them maybe not so much. Oh, by the way, the St. Louis one is still standing. But Philadelphia's gone, Boston's gone. Boston, I think, might have been the homeliest. The point is that, oh gosh, I don't know the street names. It's where it's where City Hall, yeah. And they put anyway, there was a kind of a switcheroo of open space there too. So I forget the exact piece. In any case, it is one of the only extant. There was a huge one in Cincinnati. By the way, Cincinnati, these were all the biggest cities in the country at the time. you know, it's quite arguable that the State War Navy is the best one, maybe. It certainly is, maybe probably has the most sumptuous interiors because of that federal office. You know, it was the State Department, it was the War Department, it was like had the most amazing stuff inside. And it's also perhaps, if you look at these, maybe with the exception of St. Louis, it's the most austere. So it's a kind of an interesting historic preservation argument that you can't save everything. You shouldn't probably, but you try to save the best. So, and that's, I think that's been the lucky takeaway from this. Let's go with Bill.
How much of the building was metallic? Was there much of the developing ferrous metals used in
Yeah,
construction?
actually, in this book, we kept coming up. Oh, sorry. The question is there much in the way of iron, metal, steel in the construction? Like, to what extent is it moving beyond bearing masonry? It's about the building technology. And you know, the interesting thing about this book, and you know, it's such a, there's so many interesting themes. You know, the industrialization. You know. But building technology is another thing. This is one of the, as far as we know, this is the first federal office building with an elevator. They designed them kind of like these moving lounges. They had purple plush velvet seats with carving, and it was kind of like walking into a little room. It's strange to us now, but the technology, there's two major technologies that were going on. One is granite, the granite production. Granite was so hard and difficult to work that they didn't use it for much except where you really needed it to, like, at the base of the building so it didn't soak up the water. By the 1850s, it's been industrialized to the point where or 40s, you can really, you know, you're starting to get steam, and it explodes. You get this huge granite industry in New England. You know, it's one of the basic things up here in, you know, northern Massachusetts, Maine, New Hampshire. A lot of this building came out of Maine. And what you could do is you could build these huge buildings, granite in tremendous quantity and quality, and ship it all over the place. So that's one thing. The other was fireproof construction. One of these major, the Patent Office Building, which is also in Washington, D.C., designed by Mills, burned. And I think it was in the 1860s, and lost all sorts of technological records. So there was a huge interest in trying to prevent that from happening. So one of this building is entirely, the walls are masonry bearing, but all of the floors on every level and the roof are all, well, the roof is all framed in cast iron. You look inside, there's a picture here that sort of shows it. But all the floors are done with what was done is sort of a patented system where you would do a sort of an extruded I-shaped beam about 4 feet on center, and then there were these clay tiles or bricks that would arch in between, and that was the very latest technology. So it was very much part of the. Where's that picture?
You have a section of it.
Did I just go by? I went right past it, didn't I? Or maybe it's in the book.
There.
No. You know what? I think it's in the book, but I didn't put it in this presentation. Anyway, you can see that there's a picture of it where you see all the framing of the roof. It's quite spectacular. So very critical. They also had another thing that they had actually passive heating and ventilation systems through all these flues that were built into the walls. They had fireplaces, but then they also had all this ventilation happening. So it was very technological. It's like kind of like you're kidding, but it was technologically very advanced in 1871. Yeah.
Feel free to be really short about this question.
By this time.
Could you give us your take, if you can, on the executive order under Trump for Milton?
Oh gosh.
Architecture more class,
You know,
and whether
it's.
there's any possibility of it continuing under Biden?
Oh, I think to answer the question is, it was the executive order to mandate classicism as the official style for the United States. Was the question, was that going to come back, or what?
Come back,
Or,
whether there's any
I,
creep into the Biden administration?
I think it's unlikely with the Biden administration's priorities. I don't know whether it'll happen in the future. I think it depends on elections. Really, it really depends on the leadership and advocacy and coming out of who's in charge. So that's my short answer. I actually don't have a longer one either. So, yeah.
The irony of that is
Yeah.
the modernists were arguing for diversity, if you can believe that, because the modernists are actually about anything but diversity. So that was the irony of how that entire situation played out.
The comment was that the irony of this last situation with the revocation of that executive order was that modernists, the comment here is that the modernists were in favor of diversity originally, but that is not the case with the current administration. So yeah.
I look forward to getting back and
Yeah.
looking at my old legal books, and I'm curious what role, if any, they played in this movement with Beaux-Arts. Were they following it? Were they celebrating it, or
So-
were they rejecting it?
Sorry, who?
The school, Beaux-Arts.
No. Who's the they who were copying or not? Our guys, like Mullet,
I'm
or?
curious if the school itself had a philosophy or celebrated the movement of the Second Empire.
Oh, I see the question. The question is, we talked about what was the argument for the Second Empire style, and was it, did the École des Beaux-Arts have a position on it? And again, this is getting a little bit past my real, I don't have a scholarly understanding of the École and its culture. One thing I can tell you, though, is we're talking about the expression of the Second Empire style in America, and it's actually fairly narrow in its formal characteristics. Everybody knows what the fancy house looked like that's in the movies, right? There's the haunted house. And we're familiar with these big government buildings. There isn't a tremendous amount of variation in the basic, in the recipe. So I would say, without getting into a lot of questions about the origins and the culture of the French École des Beaux-Arts and the Neo-Grec and these various different phases, I would say that they were broader in the way they applied all of these architectural things in a lot of ways. They were probably produced a kind of a bigger, fatter, 1,000 recipe cookbook. Whereas what we understand is the American Second Empire style is only about 20 pages. So that's what. So I don't know enough to say, gosh, was there somebody who was really promulgating, a revival of the stuff from the 17th century? I doubt it, but it's sort of a variant within a little bit broader picture. I think that that French school just had a more voluminous. This was really where architectural design was really fulminating in the West in the 19th century. And the first American goes there is Richard Morris Hunt. He goes there 1857 or 8. It doesn't really. It engenders the classical revival on the monumental scale in America. It sort of is inseminated by the Americans going over and coming back. So but it ends up at that point manifesting itself in much more of a strict classicism. But I think that there was probably just a much more broad expression, and what we know in America is a little bit narrower. I think there's one last question over there.
Thank you. You show each of these buildings as their own, a single monument. In a lot of cases, they're so large, they take up an entire city block. And I think we're talking about the expression, or what I found so interesting about this presentation, is the expression of the Second Empire in the United States, and then after the Civil War, battling between the Anglo or Franco cultural alliance. But with the point about the Mansard roof, it's what seems so successful about Napoleon III's empire in Paris and how it was full of arts is that there is this uniformity. I think, having gone there, the experience would be that, or the conclusion from a visitor would be that this is a society that uniformity. In Back Bay, it seems like here the Mansard roof creates these long blocks of uniform heights, similar to Washington. These are single monuments, but they seem to be inviting a continuation of a less ornate style to create more of like an urban environment. And in Boston, I think as a democratic society, to show that uniformity is a really rare thing. Napoleon III's Second Empire collapsing shows that maybe their uniformity was not democratic or ultimately successful. And my question is, as the United States government intentionally went out to build these Second Empire style municipal or government buildings, was there an adjacent public policy or zoning initiative to invite some other type of Second Empire uniformity around these as like a nucleus or a starting point?
So the question is that some of the examples in this presentation show these civic buildings from the mid to late 19th century as sort of object pieces that are so large, occupy a certain block, whereas in some ways the French antecedents, such as the Louvre and other places where there's actually a kind of a treatment with the building wall, maybe the treatment at the base, certainly the profile at the street isn't just the building, but it extends out into the rest of the city. And to what extent is that spirit reflecting either cooperation at the civic or societal level, or is it it's sort of like a question, is it top down, or how is it being formulated? And I think the question was, at the time, in the post-Civil War America, was there any encouragement of this particular style over another to actually extend that character? Is that more or less what you're asking? And I would say, I'd be, again, I don't know the administrative or legal history very well, but I'd be shocked if there had been, this was just how people built stuff. And that was, when you put out a contract and somebody, they would maybe put out a competition or commission a design, and they would go with what came back. It's actually, in a certain way, it's not that different. I mean, today, the government, advertises for design services, and they get portfolios, and they pick. It's, in a way, I don't think that there was ever any kind of stylistic fingering of a style. It's just that there was less to choose from. There was more, I think, consensus about what was proper and appropriate. And in the case of the Bourbon monarchy and the Napoleonic era, Second Empire in mid-century France, and possibly under the, is it the Second Republic? It certainly was much more top-down. It was certainly much more, the work of Haussmann. They were going in there, and did they have like what we call the right of eminent domain, where I don't know how it worked administratively, but they were certainly pushing it down from the top to create the image of Paris that we know today. That didn't happen. Again, I'm not an urban historian. I don't know exactly. I appreciate what you're saying about the uniformity, the general uniformity of the Back Bay and Commonwealth Avenue, for example. It's quite, lovely, coherent. I know I'm imagining that it was still developer driven, but I don't know. So I think in the United States it tends to be probably a little bit more bottom up. I don't know if that answers the question, but certainly I'm not aware of any formal advocacy of one style or the other. There was certainly debates among a few people, way back when, what should be the right style. But I don't think it ever made its way into administrative process. So, yeah, thank you.